My name is Hugh Meller. I'm on the Hanover Conservation Commission, and I wanted to introduce our program this evening. A couple of housekeeping chores are: one, turn your phones down. This is being produced over Zoom, thanks to the expert support from Jared Jenish and Megan Coleman of the Howe Library staff. We'll be sending out the event over Zoom. And also any chit chat will go out through the high-tech speakers that are in the room. So if you have some gossip about that person over there, maybe wait till the end of the program. So as I said, this is the second in the series. There's one more of these programs coming up in a couple of weeks. I want to thank Barbara McElroy and her list of community support that have been involved in this project over the last number of months in the planning and development of it. She is now involved 11 conservation commissions in the Upper Valley, which is, I think, quite remarkable to pull that many people together on the common problems that we are all struggling with. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Gary Moore, who's former Fish and Wildlife Commissioner and the staff for the program this evening.
Thank you. Before we begin the program, I'd like to call your attention to the slide behind. Those are all the groups that have been involved in this program and supportive in multiple ways. Many of you belong to at least 2 or 3 of those organizations, but Barbara tells me without their support, we wouldn't be here today. I'd also like to start off by introducing Jenn Goulet here. Hey, Becky.
Fuda.
Fuda.
Yep.
Okay, Bill LaPan. Okay, and Ryan Rebozo. And a little later, you'll hear from Nick Fortin, the Vermont Deer Project Manager. So with that, we'll start, and Jenn is an avid hunter. She has a BS in environmental science and an MS in plant ecology. She's worked as a plant ecologist and now has her own business assisting clients with their gardens, their landscape issues, and especially with white-tailed deer problems. So Jenn, please.
So hi, everybody. My name's Jenn, and so I'm an avid hunter, and I hunt because I love native plants. And I didn't grow up in a house where people hunted, and we didn't have guns in the house. So it makes me kind of atypical for a hunter, because it's usually something that's passed down through the family. And that wasn't my family. So, but today, I hunt all 3 seasons. I hunt archery, muzzleloader, and rifle season in Vermont and New Hampshire, and sometimes Maine. And I just love hunting. So what was the thing that flipped the switch and made me want to hunt? Taking me from a non-hunter who never even thought about it, to somebody who really loves hunting. So what happened was I was in school, I finished up, I went back to graduate, and I ran into a friend of mine who said, we had this guy from Cornell talk at one of these seminars where people present their research, and this guy was talking about you. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous because he doesn't even know me. And she's like, no, this is what he said. He said that our ecosystem is out of balance. And he said that, we have a deer problem. This is back in 2012, by the way. We have a deer problem, and the deer are eating all of the forest understory. The forest can't regenerate because, the deer are eating all the seedlings, and our ecosystem is out of balance, and we need to do something about it. And, the way it got that way was from folks fragmenting the forest, right? We build our homes, our second homes, bike trails, all kinds of stuff in the forest. And we've been squeezing deer into smaller and smaller spaces where there's less food for them. At the same time, we've extirpated all the top predators. And we don't have any more breeding populations of catamount or wolves in New England, right? So deer have less predators than ever before. The third thing was, at the time, this may not be true today, but humans were hunting in lower numbers than ever before. And so we weren't stepping up and filling that role as top predator. So this guy from Cornell, whose name I don't know, said, if you love native plants, if you love wild areas, if you love being out in the forest, and if you want native plants and our forests to be around for your children and your grandchildren, you need to hunt. And I found out later he was specifically targeting people who love native plants. And my friend Catherine said to me, she's like, Jen, you love native plants. You love native plants more than anybody I know. She's like, you need to hunt. And I was like, really? But the more I thought about it, the more I thought everything that the guy said was correct. It makes logical sense. I should hunt. So I went home to Vermont. I went online. I got myself a hunter safety booklet. I went to a field training day and I took a test. I passed the test. I got a hunting license and I went out. And that first year I harvested 0 deer and that was sad. But the next year I also went to bow hunter safety, so I could bow hunt as well. I harvested 2 deer, one during archery and one during rifle season. And, you know, I've never looked back. And I love hunting deer. I love deer and I have a lot of respect for them because I feel like, you know, it's a hard road they have to hoe. And I know that sounds crazy. I'm sorry, Barbara. I can see you're grimacing. But, you know, I love deer and I would like to see a stable, healthy deer population in Vermont and New Hampshire. And, you know, I don't want to see 20 deer starving in my driveway in February, you know, just wasting away. And so I took this guy's advice to heart. If you love native plants, if you love the forest, then you need to hunt. So I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I probably should have mentioned before we started, we're going to hold questions until the end, okay? So there'll be plenty of time to talk to everybody here, and including Nick, who will be online after the program. But in order to keep it moving, we're going to hold questions. I was asked to talk about my experiences in hunting. Barbara, when she contacted me, I guess she also contacted Jen with the same situation, to talk about the issue from the perspective of hunters. A little quick background. In the early 80s, I was the commissioner of Fish and Game in Vermont, and that's when we started the antlerless seasons, which, by the way, are extremely controversial to begin with. Now we take antlerless deer all the time, and everybody understands why you need to take antlerless deer. But anyway, I decided to read an essay that I wrote some years ago for a magazine, Why I Hunt. The reasons I hunt are many. They're also varied. My father was a hunter, as was his father. My uncles all hunted. Hunting is part of my heritage. I hunt because I like to test my skills against those of the game I'm in pursuit of. Hunting is not simply the act of killing something. It's never necessary to kill to have a successful hunt. Hunting offers me the chance to escape the madness of everyday life and to have time for my thoughts. I enjoy being in the woods alone, without interruptions. I love to hunt deer, but I'm not very good at it. Some of my friends say it's because I do not take hunting seriously enough. Most often I spend my time leaning against a tree reading a book. What a nice feeling to be sitting on a hardwood ridge as the first light of day arrives. Facing east, I watch as the sun slowly creeps up and over the mountains. Everything is quiet, but that soon changes. With light comes life and noise. First, the chickadees appear and flit around me as I sit in one of my tree stands. Noisy little birds, they have no fear of me. What fun it is to feed them bits of food that I have with me. Once in a while, one will even land on my rifle barrel and watch me. Never has one landed on me, but almost. I laugh as a little bird swoop in to land on my head or shoulder, realize I'm alive and turn at the last second. Nuthatches follow the chickadees. Those I see are red-breasted and not so numerous as the chickadees. They're also not so fearless. I can't get them to alight on any, get them to alight any closer than 6 feet from me. Soon the red squirrels begin to feed. Talk about noise. How can a creature that weighs only ounces make so much racket in the leaves? So often I turn hoping to see a buck approach only to find a red squirrel skipping along in the leaves. Red squirrels are fun to watch. They seem to be in such a hurry as winter approaches. Gathering food is paramount to survival. Much of my hunting is done on oak ridges and thus prime feeding areas for squirrels. A red leaps from tree to tree, eventually to the one I'm perched in. I don't move as he works his way down to my perch. Out of the corner of my eye, I watch. Suddenly, he comes around the trunk just inches from my head. Talk about surprise. He nearly turns inside out as he races up the tree to safety a few feet above me. Then the tongue lashing begins. I am told loudly and clearly that I am intruding and that I should leave. I laugh. Were I home in bed, I would not be able to enjoy this moment. Next to arrive are the crows, who fly over loudly, announcing the arrival of another day. No doubt they are headed for the fields a mile away where the farmer has been spreading manure. I finally ignore the birds and the squirrels and begin to read. Hunting is a time to relax, and reading is very relaxing for me. I never go hunting without a book. No doubt many deer have walked by me while I've been engrossed in a good novel. My plan is to look around after every page, but sometimes that is difficult if the book is well written. Two raucous ravens are next on the scene. They perch in a hemlock 100 yards away and proceed to discuss the world order. No wonder Poe depicted ravens the way he did. They are ugly and their voices grate on my ears. They're hard to ignore. Luckily, they don't stay long. After an hour, I force myself to put the book down. Time to get serious about watching for deer. Two big, beautiful gray squirrels begin to forage for acorns. They're much more graceful than the rambunctious reds. Eventually, they meander off and I decide to get down from my tree. Time to wander around and see what's happening. Another reason I don't do so well, I'm nosy. With one exception, all the deer I've shot have been taken while I've been sitting, but I don't sit well. I need to know what has happened on the other side of the ridge since I was last there. Maybe a magnificent buck has scraped up a big patch of woods and is just waiting for me. Maybe not, too. I slowly work my way through the woods, occasionally startling a gray squirrel or being startled by a flushing partridge. Perhaps I should leave my rifle home and bring the shotgun. I have to remind myself I'm deer hunting. The drumming of a woodpecker catches my attention. I carefully work my way to within a few yards of the tree and is mining for insects. I lean back against the sapling and watch. Sometimes it's hard to keep my mind on deer hunting. Mid-morning, and it's time to head home. I should stay in the woods, but I have work to do. Thoughts of all it needs doing eat at me. After lunch and a few hours of chores, I can feel good about going back to the woods. The last 2 hours of daylight I spent perched in my tree. I can read right up to the last half hour when failing light forces me to put the book away and pay attention. Darkness falls, and I climb down from my tree stand and head home. The woods are still, and the wind has died, and I crunch along. Suddenly, my heart nearly stops. I've walked under a big hemlock. From 5 feet over my head, there was a whoosh, and the sky is blotted out by the 6-foot wingspan of a big owl I've disturbed. It flies off, and my blood pressure returns to normal. I once again trudge home. I would not have had that experience had I been home by the fire. Deer hunting is something I look forward to each year. It is a time to be alone in the woods, a time for meditating, and a time to watch nature. I read a lot while in the woods, and I often find a sunny spot out of the wind and fall asleep. My snoring probably scares the deer in the area away, but who cares? Sometimes I wonder if I'm really having fun as the cold rain soaks me or as the wind whips heavy wet snow down my neck. Not at the moment maybe, but the temporary discomfort is only that. Hunting should be a challenge. Friends and family make deer hunting enjoyable. Look forward to the end of the day when they arrive at our camp or house to tell of their hunts. I know I'd be more successful if I spent more time in the woods, but my work ethic always draws me back after a few hours in the woods. Landowners accept that they are never caught up, and the same can be said of homeowners. I don't complain. I like cutting wood and working around the house just as I like to hunt. All right. Our first speaker is going to be Ryan Rebozo. Ryan is Director of Conservation for the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He's going to talk about his monitoring of deer density and post-forest response to a dry oak forest.
All right, thank you. Let me just get situated here, share my screen a little bit.
Ryan is so smart that a few years ago he decided to move north to my hometown.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. Yep, I'm Ryan Rebozo. I'm the Director of Conservation Science at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. Today, I was kind of asked to touch on a couple points that were important when publicizing this event. Things such as tipping points. People often want to know, what density is too high for deer, and then other things like how to monitor for deer. This kind of ties into a monitoring project that I did at the Green Mountain National Forest, and I'll talk a little bit more about. But I'll start out with this idea of a tipping point. And as you might expect, a tipping point is really only relevant to the question you're asking. So it will be pretty different based on lots of conditions. Forest type, for example, is going to play a big role. The landscape around the forest in which you're interested is going to play a big role, right? How much of this is interior forest? How much of this is edge habitat, for example, or developed? But even what you're interested in seeing a change in, right? It could be species specific. So I think when most people ask this question, they're interested in at what point do you begin to see changes in the forest, right? And that starts out at the species level. What the literature suggests, and when I say literature, I mean research on this topic. And at this point, our first speaker kind of alluded to this. In several instances, we have decades of research taking a look at how deer browse, deer herbivory impact forests. The literature suggests, depending on your habitat type, anything on the order of about 8 to 11 deer per square mile, you can begin to see impacts to preferred browse species, right? So not all species, but those species that are, the preference, those kind of most desired by deer. This is going to be relevant to the monitoring I talk about next, but oak, for example, is well known as a preferred browse species, or in this case, actually genus for deer. When you get beyond that 11 per square mile, and again, these are rough numbers and there's lots that comes into play here. When you start touching that 15 to 20 deer per square mile, we find evidence in, again, the literature that we start seeing cascading effects on the food web. That means we're moving beyond just these preferred browse species and we're starting to see impacts to other species and sometimes species that the deer aren't even eating, right? So that means now they're moving on beyond just a preferred species and they're eating other plants. So they could be impacting regeneration. And that's what we're interested in here when we're talking about impacts is a species' ability to kind of persist in this forest. So it could be other plant species, both woody and herbaceous. We have found multiple occasions where this gets into the invertebrate food web because they're very much tied to the plant biodiversity on site. Up the trophic level, so when I say trophic level, I'm talking food web up to things like birds that feed on insects, especially birds that nest on the ground or kind of in the mid-story, because now they're starting to lose that forest structure that they want, right? If you've been in a forest that has really high deer densities, you have a canopy, it looks like a forest from away, but once you walk inside, you find out you lost that forest structure. And sometimes the understory might only be just 1 or 2 species and not natives in the most extreme examples. And that's kind of that plus point I have here, invasive, right? The fact that the deer have these preferred browse species, they've evolved with these native plants, those are the ones that they're going to eat first. So they're actively kind of helping the competition of these invasives that are able to move in, especially if a site has any history of soil disturbance. That really opens the door for invasive species. Soil disturbance plus high deer densities, and you kind of have this change in forest composition. Then I have human tipping point. What do I mean by that? That's kind of a whole nother concept of tipping point. At what point do we change actions or actively try to manage for the deer herd, right? Deer density. That's tricky. Again, it depends on the site, depends on our management goals. And more often than not, it's the kind of thing that's best viewed in the rearview mirror, right? These changes to forest structure and forest composition are only really realized if we're doing some active monitoring. Otherwise, you kind of catch it after the fact. Luckily for us, we have examples of nearby states that have kind of the more extreme end of density. So we can see what that looks like. We can see kind of how that's changed forest biodiversity and some strategies other people are using to try to address that issue. But through that, we know it becomes a very expensive and a very difficult problem to address the further along it goes. I put recreational hunting in there, and that's a big piece of this, right? Trying to get recreational hunting to get a handle on the deer density. But we can see, again, in nearby states where we have extreme levels of deer density, that recreational hunting doesn't do the job, right? So we're fortunate that we're not quite at that point yet, hopefully not. I do have a point on recovery time because there's also research and literature on what does it take to recover these forests after they've been degraded by these high deer densities. This is typically done by deer exclosures, right? Physically putting up an exclosure or fence to keep deer out. It's expensive. It's time consuming. It takes a lot of follow-up and maintenance because inevitably trees are going to come down and somebody's got to clean that up, right? And it also just limits the area in which you can do that. But they are effective. And where that's happened, we found that recovery can happen, but it's often on the scale of decades, right? So it might take decades for now those seedlings to grow up and become saplings, right? And that's going to be kind of what I'm interested in monitoring as I move forward here. I'm going to throw up this one figure here. This was U.S. Forest Service modeling. It's now 6 years old already, but they were taking a look at the whole Northeast and what areas have the highest probability of seeing impacts to regeneration from deer browse. You can just make out, it's not great on this screen here, but a lot of Vermont and part of New Hampshire is kind of in that orange where it's 75, 80+% probability of impacts to forest regeneration from deer browse. Southern Vermont really lights up red here. It's 90+%, right? So we're kind of in the thick of it here. Not quite as bad as parts of Pennsylvania. We can see really light up red, but we do have a little bit of that. So I'm going to talk about this monitoring project because it plays into this story of deer density and this whole idea of forest regeneration. And I've said regeneration a couple times here. And again, all I mean is that having conditions where the species you have that represent your forest are able to reproduce and stay on the landscape, right? We're not losing them. So the work that I did was taking a look at dry oak forest. This is an uncommon natural community type in Vermont. I took a look at this area, which as the name suggests is dominated by oaks, more specifically red oaks. The plant community structure there suggests that fire has played a role in keeping it on our landscape, right? You look at the understory, you have ericaceous shrubs. That means shrubs in the blueberry family, and they do pretty well with fire. So the National Forest was interested in taking a look at using prescribed fire to maintain this ecosystem. Their concern was they were starting to see red maples and beech become a greater component of the forest, right? So because this looks like it's a fire-adapted system, they wanted to use prescribed burning as a management tool, which makes good sense, right? So I came in and my approach was to take a look at a couple dozen forest variables to see what could tell the story best of how this forest is structured and how it responds to fire, so that moving forward, we can identify those variables that tell the story best and focus on them so we can save time and money when we have to continue monitoring. So I did this in the National Forest, both where they burned and in that same natural community where they didn't burn, so a control site, and then an additional control site at a Nature Conservancy property that still had the same dry oak habitat but wasn't managed. I won't get into all of those monitoring variables now. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we're interested in today. But I do want to show just two figures that tell kind of this story of forest response, forest regeneration, and then ultimately that deer piece. Don't worry about the colors here. We'll talk about the colors next. I'm just showing here size classes, right? This is how when we're kind of trying to tell the story of a forest and its trees, we start with size classes. It's a good proxy for age because you're not going to be able to core everything, and it doesn't really work quite as well for saplings, so we look at size. If we're looking at each of these blocks, they're different sizes. You can see 0 to 6 inches, 6 inches to a foot on down the road. So on the left side of the screen are our seedlings. And each size class has 3 bars. All that means is our burn site and our 2 controls. Seedlings are going to have the highest density, right? This is stem density. This is absolutely what we expect. And there's a couple of reasons, right? Seedlings are small. You can fit a lot of them in a small space, right? So you're going to have high densities. And they haven't been around long enough to be subject to all the selection pressures that are going to cause mortality, right? Seedlings are fragile. A drought could kill them. Something can come and eat them, all kinds of things. They haven't been around long enough. In fact, these first 2 bars are the seedlings that germinated the same year that we were doing the study, right? So they just popped, basically. So we expect that. If we look all the way on the right-hand side, those are our canopy trees, the biggest ones. Now we're measuring them in dBH, right? Diameter of breast height. People probably are familiar with that. These are our canopy trees, lower density, and you'd expect that, right? Bigger trees need more space. But what I'm interested in is this sapling size class. And we saw much lower densities, even lower densities in our canopy trees. And the reason I'm interested in saplings is because when we want to maintain a natural community, and in this case, we wanted to keep this as a red oak forest, you got to have your seedlings become mature canopy adults so that they can reproduce too, right? That's the missing gap. You got to be a sapling before you can be a canopy tree. So at our first pass, we saw very low densities. So to try to get that a little bit more, we looked at species. Now this is messy, got lots of colors, but we'll walk through this here, right? The color I'm interested in here is the blue. Blue is going to be our oak trees. We can look at the right, again, our canopy trees dominated by oak, right? 90% oak. So that's good. That's what we want. Oak is still showing up in our seedlings, right? 15, 25% of our seedlings. Seedlings are always going to be a mix because you got seeds from all kinds of trees coming in and they're going to pop. Not all are going to survive. But we have good reason to believe that all of our oak trees are creating new seedlings. But when we look again in this sapling class that we already know is low densities, that we don't have many of, we essentially lose that blue. No oaks are making it in there, right? So there's a gap here. Again, the forest, if we were just looking at the trees, is what we want. It's a condition we want. The forest floor conditions is still functioning in its ability to germinate new seedlings, oak seedlings. But when we get to this middle age class, we lose them. So initially we think, well, maybe it's the fire, right? Because that was one of the goals, is to introduce some mortality to our maple and beech saplings. And that's true, there was lots of mortality, but even when we look at the control sites, we essentially lose those oaks. So there's a gap, right, in this life history transition. One of the variables that we looked at beyond this, not surprisingly, is deer herbivory. And we found in these sites that for saplings, we were getting 80+% saplings with signs of deer herbivory, right? So there is a pressure there. Coupled with the fact that we know oak are real preferred browse species, is starting to tell us a little bit of a story of what might be that selection pressure that keeps those saplings from being alive long enough to become, those seedlings alive long enough to become saplings. So we tried to look at deer density more specifically, right? Browse is a good proxy. We know there's a lot of browse, but now how many deer are there, right? This kind of rounds out the question. We did this using drones. We had a drone with a thermal camera mounted on, and what we did is we would run transects 500 feet apart that covered the entire natural community that we were interested in, but also the extent at a minimum of a deer home range. Again, lots of variability in what a deer home range is. Literature suggests that in ag and forest up in the Northeast, it's at least 1 square mile. So we did that as a minimum, plus we covered our entire natural community. We also did a couple other things to kind of make sure we had the most conservative estimate of density, right? We did this at night, so there was the greatest contrast between the forest floor and all the animals that we saw, and things lit up pretty well. ID was surprisingly easy with these cameras. We also did this in April for a few reasons, right? Prior to leaf out makes it easier to see what's moving around on the forest floor. It's prior to fawns being born, and it's after the hunting season and after winter mortality, right? So this is going to be, again, the most conservative estimate of deer density that we can get. Average deer density based on Fish and Wildlife reports is something on the order of 1.6 fawns per doe the last time I saw. So we can expect densities to be much higher during the growing season, but we wanted that most conservative estimate. We had a bunch of quality control measurements or protocols built into this to make sure we weren't double counting deer. And it really proved to be a time-efficient method. As you can expect, you can cover a lot of ground with the drone, much more so than other past methods that we use to estimate deer density. It allowed us to access areas and sites that we wouldn't have if we wanted to do spotlighting or even, scat transects. And again, it gives us really good confidence in our estimates moving forward. So we're really happy with this technique. We're able to map this as we ran our transects. So we were building a map as we ran the drone and calculating density as we did it. What did we end up with? We ended up with 10 deer per square mile at the Green Mountain National Forest site, 12 deer per square mile at the Nature Conservancy site, right? So these are kind of at that number that the literature suggests you might be seeing impacts to grouse species. And in fact, in the case of the oak forest, that's what we were seeing with our follow-up forest measurements. So, I think I say all that to highlight, first of all, a method that I think is pretty worthwhile, that I think is time efficient and cost effective in the long run for monitoring deer if we want to have a really good sense and high confidence into our deer density estimates over a large area, right, at the landscape scale. But I also say that because I think it has both these biodiversity implications. Unless we have these types of deer density estimates coupled with, forest response, we often miss these interactions until it's, a couple years down the road, right? And I talked about how recovery can happen, but it can take on the order of a decade or so, right? So we miss a lot of these impacts to regeneration until we see it after the fact, until it's blatantly obvious. It's less obvious in these forests, to be honest with you, because, like I said, the canopy is still very much oak. There are saplings, but if you look at the saplings, they were dominated by beech and aspens, right? Big tooth aspens. And we know that these are species that produce coppice growth, right? They can be trimmed back and they're going to produce many stems. So that our density are based on those two species that have that life history trait that lends themselves well to this. But we're missing other things. We were missing our oaks. Even red maples were reduced in some spots. So this kind of just tells that story of monitoring coupled with these deer density estimates to get that full story. But beyond the biodiversity piece, which is important, there's also management implications, right? Think of land managers or foresters that want to manage their land and want to have confidence that with their prescription, the forest is going to be on a trajectory to do this. Well, unless you have a good sense of deer density and account for that, that might alter your regeneration on site and might alter your outcome or your product, right? That was the case. It seems like that's the case here, right? The fire did a lot of things right. It did a lot of things that they had in their management plan. They wanted to reduce leaf litter. They wanted to have a certain level of sapling mortality. They wanted to exclude invasive. All that was done. But they're still, even though they had that successful burn, still not getting the regeneration that they want. And it's likely because we didn't account for deer prior to this. So it's a complicated story. There's no one answer for the perfect deer density or the tipping point. But there are things we can point to that gives us good clues as to where we should be and things we should look for moving forward, especially when management is our main focus. So that's all I've got. And I'll take some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Next up is Becky Fuda. Becky's a wildlife biologist and the deer project leader for the Hampshire Fish and Game. She's worked a wide variety of wildlife species ranging from butterflies to grizzly bears. Quite a wide range there, right?
Yeah.
Grizzly bears don't fly. But now she focuses on deer management for New Hampshire. Her topic is deer management in New Hampshire and strategies for addressing locally overabundant deer populations, which is pretty much this area.
Can't see my cursor. Oh. I seem to have no cursor. I'm not sure what's going on. I can see it like floating around, but. We could just get that. Is there a shortcut to get that? But then we need to also share the screen.
Do you want to do it moving again?
The screen share is not sharing.
Oh. And there's.
Oh, there it is. It came back. There you go.
You don't have to do sound. Do you have sound on your side?
No, I don't have sound. Okay. All right. Okay. So, again, my name's Becky Fuda. I'm the deer biologist with New Hampshire Fish and Game. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we manage deer in New Hampshire, as well as specifically our DMAP program. So we manage deer and most of our big game species based on our game management plan. So those plans are last for 10 years. We're coming up on the end of our previous one right now, so we're actually working on revising that. And we go through a whole public process with this. We have a public comment period. It gets adopted by the commission. We have public meetings. But this is really what guides our management in New Hampshire. So the management plan, it breaks the state up into 20 different deer management units. And so those units are going to be, the boundaries are going to be based on relative deer density, habitat differences, human population density, weather conditions. And so we kind of try to find a balance between capturing that variation without having, 100 different units that would overly complicate our regulations, right? So this is kind of a boring chart here, but in our management plan, we set objectives for each of those units that you saw on the map there. Oh, and I forgot to mention that we're in G1. So Hanover is going to be in our G1 unit there, in the circled in red. So within our management plan, we set an objective for each unit. And that objective is in terms of adult buck kill. So adult buck kill is what we use as an index to our population in New Hampshire. Our seasons for adult bucks stay relatively constant from year to year. So if hunter effort, stays relatively stable, it can serve as somewhat of an index to the population. And it's a data point that's easily available to us, right? So we need to have something that we can actually collect to use as our objective. So for G1, you can see our objective is 340 bucks. And currently our level's at 438, so we're 22% above our objective right now in G1. And I will say we do use a 2-year running average, just a side note, a 2-year running average of the adult buck kill just kind of smooths out some of that variation we see from year to year. We might see variation in hunter success rates due to weather conditions during the hunting season, as well as things like food availability out in the woods. So when we think about how we want to manage our deer population, we have to consider that deer are polygamous and they're highly productive, right? So bucks can breed multiple does, and some does can even have a fawn in their first year. Not very many of them, and they tend to have a fawn every year, and they can have 2 fawns, they can even have 3 fawns. So they're highly productive, right? So if we want to influence the population, what segment of the population do we need to focus on? I'm covering some of this because I'm sure some of you are familiar, but I'm not sure everyone's familiarity with these concepts. But we would want to focus on the does, right? And so we call this the antlerless harvest. And the reason why we say antlerless rather than adult does is that when setting regulations and enforcing regulations, it's really difficult to distinguish between it's somewhat difficult, at least, to distinguish between a doe and a fawn during the hunting season. So we can't really have separate seasons for does and fawns. So our antlerless harvest is going to include adult does as well as any female and some male fawns as well. And so that's really the segment of the population that is going to have an impact. If you protect all of your adult does, you're going to give that population more ability to grow. Whereas if you harvest more adult does, you might see that population decrease. Does that make sense? Okay. So, like was mentioned earlier, we have 3 major seasons in New Hampshire, major hunting seasons. We have as well as youth season. But the three major ones are going to be archery season, muzzleloader season, and firearm season. So the way that we can influence our antlerless harvest is by changing the amount of opportunity provided to hunters to harvest antlerless deer, right? And the way we do that in New Hampshire is actually a little bit unusual in terms of, if you compare it to other states at least. So during each of these seasons, we can manipulate the number of what we call any deer days. So those are the days where hunters can harvest anything, antlerless or antlered deer. So in our archery season is pretty simple. It's any deer throughout the state, throughout the season. So we keep that consistent generally. We have for some time now. But during the muzzleloader and the firearm seasons, the number of days that are any deer days where you have the option to harvest antlerless deer, it varies across the state depending on which unit you're in. So if you look at G1 there, last year we had 5 days that were any deer days during the muzzleloader season, as well as 5 days during the firearm season. So it is a pretty liberal season for harvesting does or for harvesting antlerless deer compared to the rest of the state, except for units L and M, which are down on the seacoast. So you might be wondering, how do we decide whether or not we should be adjusting this opportunity, right? So that goes back to our management plan, right? So those population objectives and that boring chart I had up in the beginning. So where is our population relative to that objective and what's its trend? So we can look at G1 here. In red, we have the objective, $340, and in black, we have our 2-year average of adult buck kill. So you can see that it was it still is well above objective, but it sort of peaked in 2019 there, and it has started to come down since then. And so we set our seasons every 2 years. So last year we set them, and we'll be setting them again next year for deer. And so last year when we set that season, I didn't have the last data point there, but it appeared that we had a population that was above objective, but it was on a decreasing trend. So this is kind of a chart that is just kind of gives us an idea of how we make these decisions, right? Rule of thumb, that's what I'm looking for. And so we didn't propose any changes in G1 last year. Now, depending on what things look like next year, if it seems like that decline is now, leveling off and stabilizing, we may make a different decision next year. We'll have another data point at that point. So we'll just have to see where things stand then. And another thing to keep in mind is we do have, so we have this option of expanding those number of days where does can be harvested. And in 2 units in the state, in units L and M, we also do actually issue additional antlerless permits. So that is a route that we've taken down there because those units had remained above objective for a long time despite very liberal antlerless seasons down there. So a large number of days where you could harvest does. So that is a path that, perhaps we may take in other units in the future, but there's still a lot of room to increase the number of antlerless days in G1 if needed. Okay, so getting on to our Deer Management Assistance Program. So this is a program that was started in 2018. It was before I was here, but it's used in situations where deer populations are locally overabundant, right? So maybe we want to have some more tailored management at a sub-WMU level. So often these areas might be areas that historically have not had a lot of hunter access, or they could be suburban areas where it's difficult to hunt. maybe there's some large landowners that don't allow hunting. But there could be situations where you have too many deer and it might just be in one particular town and not, you know, the entire management unit. And so this kind of allows us to focus that harvest in that one area. So this program allows municipalities to apply, so towns to apply for extra antlerless permits. They have to designate a special deer management area. So they apply, the deadline's the first Monday in July. So before that, they have to go around and get permission from landowners that are interested in participating in this program and that are willing to allow these special permits to be used on their property. And then the town issues the permits. So Hanover has participated since 2018. Thus far, we've had more hunter interest than we've actually had permits available. So we've been issuing last few years 150 permits, and they've had to do a lottery because there's been around 175 applicants. And without increasing the area within that special deer management unit, there's probably not a lot of room to really expand the number of permits very much. Maybe a little bit of wiggle room, but where we stand today, we probably want to increase that area if we wanted to really increase the number of permits. So looking at the percent of DMAP tags that are filled, up until 2023, it was above 20%, which is quite high for New Hampshire. If you look at our antlerless permits in L&M, they range more from around 10% to 18% from year to year. So the success rates were fairly high. It dropped down quite a bit last year. You know, too soon to really know why that is. If it's a trend that we see continuing, it could be because the deer population has decreased in that deer management area. Could be less interest from hunters. Tough to know right now, but we'll have to see where that trend goes. I know Barbara was interested in hunter numbers, so I threw this slide in here. This is only from 1997 because that was just the data that was easily available to me when I made it. But you could see, like many states, we did have a decline in hunter numbers in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is the number of deer hunters, which in New Hampshire is actually not exactly straightforward to calculate because not everybody that buys a hunting license hunts deer, but most of them do. So this is our estimated number of deer hunters. And so you can see it's declined quite a bit, and then it leveled off sort of in the mid-2000s. We had that jump that a lot of states saw during the pandemic, and that has actually, our numbers have really sustained since having that jump. But you can also look at the total number of deer tags issued. So it's a little different way to look at it. You know, in New Hampshire, there's different deer tags. You can get your regular hunting license, which gives you your firearms deer tag. You can also get your archery tag. So we actually have a similar number of deer tags out there that we had in the early 90s. So there's fewer hunters, but they have more tags in their pocket. Now, that doesn't, you know, necessarily, if somebody with a whole bunch of tags, after they get one or two deer, they don't always put as much effort into harvesting that third or fourth deer. But there's still, the opportunity out there has remained pretty stable. We do have a number of programs that we use to encourage hunter recruitment. We have our hunter education classes. Hunter ed is required for anybody 16 years of age and older, unless you're an apprentice. So we also have an apprentice license program. So adults that are interested in getting into hunting, they can hunt for 1 year with a mentor without taking hunter ed. So if you're not really sure you want to and you just want to try it out, you can do it for 1 year with mentor without taking hunter ed. We have our Becoming an Outdoors Woman programming. There's a bunch of different events. They teach archery, they teach shooting, they teach field dressing, all kinds of all kinds of good stuff at that program. We have our Elbrook Hunter Education Center in Holderness who do learn to hunt workshops, 2 free public archery ranges, and we also put out some YouTube how-to videos. And that's all I have. I'll take your guys' questions later.
Next up is Nick Fortin. He's the wildlife biologist in Vermont, head of the Vermont Deer Program. He's Becky's equivalent in Vermont. We're going to see a video of the 2023 deer harvest report. Welcome, Nick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Fortin, Deer and Moose Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And in this presentation, I'm going to review some of the results from the 2023 deer hunting seasons, as well as the current status of deer in Vermont. And then we'll look at some potential regulation changes that the department is considering. We know that weather conditions often have an effect on the deer harvest. And last fall, that effect was particularly noticeable. October temperatures were well above average across the state, and warmer temperatures usually result in deer being less active during daylight hours. On top of that, it rained every weekend in October.
Yes, it did.
November and early December temperatures, on the other hand, were actually a bit below normal in most areas. Additionally, many areas saw at least some snow cover, which helps hunters locate and see deer.
Hiking, biking, and
End result is that harvest numbers were down in all of the October seasons, but up in the regular season in November and the December muzzleloader season. The total harvest, 16,845 deer, was down slightly from the previous 3-year average, but it was consistent with harvest numbers over the previous 7 years. Notably, the buck harvest of 9,848 was up from the previous 3-year average, but again, similar to buck harvest over the previous 7 years. Antlerless harvest declined from 2022 despite an increase in the number of antlerless permits. This was mostly due to poor hunting conditions in October, when much of the antlerless harvest typically occurs. Regardless, the 6,997 antlerless deer harvested was 15% below the recommended antlerless harvest of about 8,300 deer. That shortfall, combined with the easiest winter for deer on record, is going to result in a noticeable increase in deer numbers this year. While that may bode well for hunting prospects this fall, it also creates some significant management challenges and concerns. Last fall, our objective was to stabilize deer numbers roughly where they were in most of the state, and to reduce deer numbers in the areas shown here in red that have too many deer. Now, a few areas can certainly handle a small increase in deer numbers without causing any major issues. But for most areas, an increase was not and is not desirable. We simply cannot support more deer than we already had, and there will likely be a lot more red on this map this year. And we know we have too many deer in many areas because we're seeing a steady decline in health measures. So this chart shows yearling antler beam diameters since 1985. Now, this is one of the most commonly used measures of deer herd health. We can see that although there's certainly variability from year to year due to things like winter severity or maybe the abundance of mast crops, we've had a slow, steady decline over the past 30 plus years. This is very clear evidence that we've had and continue to have more deer than our habitat can support in many areas. Now, we're not saying that we have extremely high numbers of deer or that deer numbers have increased substantially. Simply that we have more deer than our habitat can support. We know our deer habitat quality is poor and probably declining in many areas, largely because our forests are getting older. Today, middle-aged, mature forests, like the photo on the right, dominate most of the Vermont landscape, with limited amounts of both young and old forests. Wildlife in Vermont require a diversity of forest habitat conditions, and young forests, like the photo on the left, provides essential food and cover for many species of wildlife, including deer. The amount of young forest habitat has a significant influence on how many deer an area can support. Even old forests, what some call old growth forests, are more complex and provide more food and cover than the even-aged mature forests that dominate Vermont today. Killing fewer does with the hope of increasing deer numbers isn't going to solve this problem, and in the long term, it's likely to make things worse. So if you'd like to see more deer in your area, work to improve the habitat and advocate for others to do the same. But in the meantime, let's work to keep our deer healthy and keep them in balance with the habitat we've got. Now I'd like to shift gears a bit and discuss some potential deer hunting regulation changes. So when we passed the last big package of hunting regulation changes in 2019, the Department and Fish and Wildlife Board agreed to wait 5 years before making any additional changes. That was to give us enough time to see what effect those regulation changes would have. And so 2024, this coming fall, will be the 5th year under those new regulations. And we are planning to discuss some potential adjustments next winter. To start that discussion, I want to go over a few items that we are already considering, but I also want to be clear that we are not looking to make sweeping changes like we did 5 years ago. So the first item we're considering is whether we should move Youth Weekend back to the weekend before the regular season, where it was before. So Youth Weekend harvests have been declining for many years. Much of this is due to a decline in the number of youth in Vermont, not just the number of youth hunters, but all youth in Vermont. However, the number of youth in the population leveled off several years ago. The decline in the harvest has been much more pronounced over the past 4 years since the season was moved 2 weeks earlier. And it turns out this is mostly due to lower success rates with that earlier season timing. In the past, success rates during Youth Weekend were consistently around 25%. But over the past 4 years, they've been hovering around 21%. Now, that may not seem like much, but it equates to about 180 fewer successful youth hunters in 2023, and that would have added almost 20% to our Youth Weekend harvest. So this decline could be partly due to deer activity, with the earlier timing being before the increased activity that is associated with that rut or pre-rut period in early November. But we actually think a lot of this is related to lower hunting effort, mainly due to conflicts with other activities like fall sports. So most sports teams are still playing in October, whereas by early November, most of them are done unless they're in a state championship game. So anecdotally, we've heard from many families over the past 4 years at check stations that were only able to hunt one day or part of one day because of a conflict like a football game that weekend. The youth weekend is very important for many reasons, so we would like to address this issue if we can. The next item relates back to removing the antler restriction in some WMUs, which is one of the changes that took effect in 2020. That has worked well in most places, but there are a few WMUs where that may be creating some issues. So we know from multiple surveys that hunters are interested in at least having a chance of seeing or maybe harvesting a mature buck. So in the current big game plan, we have management objectives for the number or proportion of mature bucks in the population. The way we've decided to track that or ensure we reach that is by ensuring that yearling bucks never make up more than 50% of the buck harvest. That ensures that the overall harvest rate, or the proportion of all bucks that are killed by hunters each year, is low enough that enough bucks are surviving to those older age classes to meet the desires of hunters. There are several WMUs in northern Vermont that have exceeded that threshold in recent years. Now, we don't have age results for 2023 yet, but it appears that those WMUs will also be close to or exceed 50% again. If this continues, it is unlikely that we'll be able to meet our buck management objectives. So we'll need to consider ways to reduce the buck harvest in these units. We'll probably try an outreach and education approach first, trying to get hunters to voluntarily pass on young bucks. But if that doesn't work, we may need to change regulations, potentially reinstating the antler restriction. We also need to establish some expanded archery zones. So these are basically suburban archery zones where the archery season would begin September 15th and be antlerless only until the regular archery season begins on October 1st. Now, the ability to establish these zones was part of the changes made 5 years ago, but we haven't actually established any zones yet. So, of course, we'd like to do that and help manage those suburban deer populations. And the last major item we're considering right now is how can we harvest more antlerless deer in some WMUs? Our current regulations work fine in much of Vermont, but in some areas, we simply cannot harvest enough antlerless deer in most years under the current system to meet our deer population objectives. Currently, our greatest limitation is the low fill rate that we have on muzzleloader antlerless permits. So that new October muzzleloader season was intended to increase fill rates during this season, but it has not increased fill rates at all. Now, these low fill rates mean that we have to give out a lot of permits to harvest a relatively small number of antlerless deer. And in some WMUs, we simply do not have enough muzzleloader hunters to issue the number of antlerless permits that are needed. Now, we don't know what the changes would be at this point, but everything is on the table. We need to have the tools to effectively manage our deer population as our winters continue to get easier. And of course, we also want to consider any other opportunities there may be for improving our ability to manage the deer population and improving the quality of the deer hunting experience in Vermont. For more information on the 2023 deer harvest and deer management in Vermont, visit vtfishandwildlife.com.
Thank you, Nick. I'm sure there'll be questions for you after we have our last speaker. Bill LaPan is up next. Bill became president of the Grafton County Fish and Game Commission Association in 2011, has been extremely active ever since with them. Hunter safety and the ranges have been big with Bill. Many of you know Bill, if you're from this area, his career was with the Lebanon Fire Department. So, Bill?
Thanks, everybody, for having me. And my talk tonight is not going to be so much about the deer population and what Grafton County Fish and Game is doing for the deer population. It's more on the outside of how we can help hunters and firearm safety. We're located at 153 Trues Brook Road in West Lebanon on 53 acres. And we are a 100% volunteer organization. It's a very active club. We have right around 560 members currently. And most of those members are from New Hampshire and Vermont. There's two types of memberships that we have. There's target shooters, and then there's hunters. A combination of both make up some of these. The importance is for all hunting aspects. We have a shotgun field that does trap, skeet, and 5-stand, a 100-yard rifle range with intermediate berms, a handgun range that has a 45-yard distance with a dueling tree added, a small bore range, which is rimfire only, which is 50 yards, a stationary archery range, and a 3D walking course. The 3D course gets set up. It'll be set up in a couple of weeks. And it takes about an hour and a half to do the course. It goes through the woods and up and down our road with several targets. There's actually, in the summertime, almost every evening, there's an event going on. Safety is our #1 priority. We have training classes on firearm usage, the care of firearms, the basic handgun, and tactical basics. We host hunter education through New Hampshire Fish and Game. When they want to schedule it, they have the use of our facilities. We sponsor youths to go to Berry Conservation Camp and to the Vermont Conservation Camp every year. This year we have 5 youths that we're sponsoring to attend camp. When they attend these camps, they earn their hunter's safety education at the camps. Most of our open shoots that are open to the public during the summer months is trap, skeet, archery, tactical handgun. And we do have a retired group of shotgunners that one of our members will send out an email that looks like good weather that day. Let's have skeet or trap or something. Our women's group, I've always been under the theory that guys are always going to shoot. Women and children are the future of our sport. So the more women that we can get interested, more children that we can get interested, the better. Our women's group this year is sponsoring our Women's Only Range Day, which we average about between 50 and 60 women each Women's Day. And they come in and they break up into groups. They do shotgun, handgun, archery, and rifle. Break them up into groups and they switch around so that they all get to experience everything. We feed them. We supply all the firearms, all the ammunition. It doesn't cost them a dime. Everything's done by donation. We've had women come in the morning physically shaking because they're so nervous about shooting. And at noon, to come in for lunch, big smiles on their face, and they say, this is the greatest thing ever. So it does have a good impact. And we do pick up new members every time we have that. We've got enough women members now this year so that they're the ones that are running the Women's Day. The guys used to run it, and now we've got enough women so that they're going to take it over and run it. We're still going to be coaches, but they're the ones running it. And this is going to be our 11th year doing the Women's Day. This year, Grafton County Fish and Game is going to host the Archery New England Triple Crown. It's part of the International Bow Hunters Association, and we're expecting anywhere from 150 to 200 shooters from all over New England, and that's July 27th and 28th. We have two of our members that keep an eye on legislation in Vermont and New Hampshire, and they give us a monthly report at our monthly meetings on what's going on with the Senate in New Hampshire and in Vermont, and what some of the bills are going to affect. We also sponsor the Dream Hunt, which is an organization that picks a youth that is either surviving cancer or not going to survive cancer or some other disease, and they, through Fish and Game, they get a permit for a moose hunt, and they do a moose hunt with them. And it's very successful. They had, last year they did one with a youth that was confined to a wheelchair, so they had to make a special wheelchair to get him out in the woods, and he got a huge moose. Bill, I can't remember how big it was, but it was,
I don't know.
it was a huge moose.
It was nice.
Very.
It was a
nice.
keeper for anyone.
Let's see. So how does Grafton County benefit the community for hunting and shooting sports? And the only thing I can say is our facility, we concentrate on safety. So the more safe a shooter you are, the better you are in the woods, the better shot you are, the less wounded animals we have. So that's one way that we affect. Every member in our organization has to attend an orientation, which we give a complete tour of all our ranges and explain the rules and club operations. And we explain everything from placement of targets to if you want to have a guest with you. Local police departments, security departments are also members. They practice and they qualify to maintain their job skills. And we usually, when the police department wants to use the range, we just send out an email and say, police are going to be using the range this day, let them do their job. So that they don't mind if you go up and watch. In fact, they'll ask you if you want to join in, but we like to leave them alone so they can do their job. There's several classes offered, like I said, that makes your hunting experience more enjoyable. Just the fact that you can communicate with other shooters at the ranges, it helps you become a better and safer shooter. Members of Grafton County have competed all over the United States, some in Canada, for trap events, handgun competition, archery shoots, rifle competition, and several of our members attained championship status. I did tell you that women and children are the future of the shooting sports. Grafton County is also very environmentally proactive. We test the soils on our ranges 2 or 3 times a year to check the acidity. If it's too high in acid, then we'll spread lime. Our ranges are built in a U with concrete backing so that if the EPA says you have to reclaim your lead, it's a matter of scoop it out, sift it, put it right back in. We recycle all our cardboard and paper that gets turned in, and recycle lead from the berms and from the bullet traps. And we also recycle all of our brass that gets picked up. You can visit our website at www.gcfga.org. If you have any more questions, I'll be glad to answer them. We're all done.
Thank you, Bill. Is there any member of the Hampshire Fishing Game Commissioner here? Commission? Yes, please stand up. I know who you are, but stand up and let them know who you are.
Nice to see you again. Paul DeBoo, Grafton County out of Plymouth, New Hampshire. So I'm glad I got to come here and witness this and absorb some of it and report back. Good job, Becky.
Thank you.
And good job to all of you.
Is there any member of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board here?
Nick Burnham, I'm from Heartland, Vermont. I represent Windsor County on the board. Many of you may know that the Vermont board right now is going through a very big struggle. We have a legislative act trying to disband the board and make it legislative actions to dictate fish and wildlife policy. So if you're a Vermont resident, keep an eye on that, please, and work on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The terminology, sometimes people get mixed up because we're in the Connecticut River Valley in two different states, but it's the terminology. New Hampshire has a Fish and Game Commission. Vermont has a Fish and Wildlife Board. He's a board member, he's a commissioner. The head of the department in New Hampshire is the executive director. In Vermont, the head of the department is the commissioner. So anyways, they do the same jobs, different. New Hampshire has one commissioner for each county plus an extra one for the seacoast. Vermont has one board member for each of the 14 counties. The commission, the board, set regulations. The biologists educate the board members, commission members, and so forth. But they are supposed to represent the public, which is why they represent counties. So anyway, just so you understand the difference in terminology. So before I turn it over to questions, there are 2 hearings in Vermont coming right up on the regulations, the proposals that for the coming seasons that Nick was talking about. The first one will be Monday, May 6th in Rutland, at Rutland High School. And the other one that most of us will be interested in is Wednesday, May 8th. It'll be up at Thetford Academy. They both start at 6:30 p.m. I'll open it up to questions. Yes.
Hello, Steve Mortillo, National Park Service. I have a question for Becky. When you guys are setting your management thresholds, is any of that based on vegetative data or vegetation data or regeneration data?
So we don't have, data like that for the entire state, obviously. So not on hard data, no, but it's based on a number of things. So when we set the management plan, so we'll be doing a public survey that was done with the previous management plan as well. And that survey asks the public about how they feel about deer population levels in their area. So we can get some feedback that way. But like everything we do, it's all a public process. And so we get public comments during our season settings from all those public meetings and during the public comment period. So that's what we sort of rely on to hear where there are issues. And then in that case, we might go out in the field to a certain area to see if, to confirm on the ground.
Ma'am?
Yes, I live in Hanover on Ockham Pond, which I would describe as a sanctuary city for deer because it has become a no-go area for hunting because of the student population that's nearby, and lots of people who like to enjoy walking around the pond. And so on any given day, I can have as many as 8 deer wandering into my garden, which they have turned into a delectable salad bowl. And I have, tried to spray and to, keep them at bay, but they are just very uninhibited. They're not frightened of me or I think of any other humans. And I know another neighbor is here who will vouch for what I'm saying. What can we do?
I mean, it's pretty tough. Are you in like a compact area where there's no possibility for hunting? Is that what you're describing?
Yes.
Within,
Yeah.
so the setbacks
Yes.
would prevent hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to protect your plants in that case, fencing is really the only thing that's going to keep them out 100%.
And I have a feeling that's not going to happen. What would you say, Bill?
Yes.
He lives there too.
My name's Bill Young, and I live in that neighborhood as well. There's a contiguous to that is what used to be the Dartmouth Golf Course. It's now a very sizable area called Pine Park. Pine Park is something that potentially could be cordoned off, closed off for a, what do you call it, a deer management assistance program, a DMAP. So I guess my question is, are there people here from the town of Hanover and Dartmouth College who would be willing to talk with Pine Park Associates and with Occam neighborhood folks to kind of see whether that's an option? Anyone here from the town of Hanover? And does anyone know that?
Right in front of you.
Yeah. You want Occam?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Do you want, so that.
No,
we'll-
just so you know who's there.
We'll dig into that question then with the town of Hanover. It came up maybe 10 years ago when they were talking about, the folks from Cornell were talking about the 2 does for a buck and the interesting experiment they did with doing hysterectomies on the bucks in Ithaca, New York. Do y'all know that story? No, the Cornell has a veterinary school. They did hysterectomies on all they live trapped a bunch of does. They did hysterectomies on them. I'm in human reproduction, but I realize that humans and deer are a little bit different, but the does remained in estrus constantly. So every buck in upstate New York and Vermont moved to Ithaca, New York. We're not going to do that, but anyway, we will probably, but anyway, that's a question. I would just have this, since I have the floor for 1 second. I'd like to thank Barbara McElroy, who's been helpful in organizing this. If you want to see her attack invasive species, be careful. She's really big on wild, bad plants. But this is a really wonderful forum of people, and with very experienced people, very wise people. Everybody who's spoken tonight did a good job. I've worked a bunch with the state police and the Department of Justice and talking with the police about guns. Guns are central. Talked about bows here. The folks in the police department didn't want to hear my message that you need to make sensible gun rules. And the folks you're talking here, I did not hear assault weapon mentioned once here tonight. Handgun training, I heard, but I don't know many people are hunting deer with handguns or with assault weapons. So those of you who have a voice, who have credibility with authorities and talk to authority, please think this through and deliver your message. There, we have a gun problem in the United States. There are a lot of people being killed as well as deer. I'm a former hunter. I'm okay with the deer. I'm not okay with humans. But a lot of people in the country don't believe that. So folks who have credibility, who have a voice, who are perhaps members of the National Rifle Association, and certainly talk to higher authorities, please remind them that we need to do this in a cautious way. This is a great program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
How do you, a question for Becky, how do you estimate the deer density in the various management units?
So we do have a model that estimates density, but like I spoke about in the presentation, we don't use that for management. We use an index, which is the adult buck kill. So it's density, estimating density at a statewide scale is very difficult because of the amount of data that would be required. Like I said, we do have a model. We just don't have, we have a model that's based on harvest data. We don't have anything that compares to compare it to really validate that model, I should say.
But if you have high density in areas, for instance, they're talking about Occam Pond, where there's no one killing deer in that area, in the compact area of Chown, because it's prohibited. So
Yeah.
then how do you have any idea of how many deer you have? Because they're not culling deer from that area. So you can't make any kind of guesses at deer density based on the
Right.
fact that, well, we only have so many deer that have been killed in this particular.
We would never be able to estimate densities at some small, we're managing at a much larger level. So yeah, we wouldn't be able to manage density in this part of, or estimate density in this part of Hanover. But I guess what I would say is, I encourage folks to not so much to focus on the actual hard number, but what are the impacts? I mean, we know that the densities there are too high, right? Because we're hearing about the impacts. So I think that actually having that hard number of what the actual density is less important when we know that there's too many, right?
Well, I think in Hanover, people would like to see more antlerless deer days. So how could that be achieved if we don't have basic data on certain categories of deer?
So we have the DMAP program, and that provides those additional antlerless permits that I was talking about. In terms of more antlerless deer days, that would be at the Wildlife Management Unit area scale.
Yeah.
And so if that adult buckkill remains above objective, then we would potentially propose increasing that in the next season setting. But it wouldn't just be for Hanover. It would have to be at the G1 scale.
Up in the back and then over here.
Yes.
Don Downey, I'm a forester. I work private public lands pretty much within about an hour of Hanover. And I was kind of shocked from the answer to a question before that I was thinking that the harvest was driven by like from the ecological side of things, as in what population can the landscape support.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's like asking the public, do you think there are enough deer? Like it sounds like there's really not much science going into this. So I'm wondering, like you have that number of 340.
Yeah.
Based on what? Like what? Because back in, where that was below what was actually being harvested, like 2005, 2010, you couldn't regenerate oak back then.
Okay.
You couldn't regenerate sugar maple. So like 340, what's that from? And why is it driven by what the public thinks rather than what the ecology is telling us?
So we set those numbers in our management plan, right? And we look, where has the harvest historically been and what sort of impacts were we seeing when the population was at that level? And so, again, we don't have the capacity to go out and do browse surveys in every unit. But we hear from, we're constantly interacting. It's not just hearing from the public. Obviously, our biologists are in the field as well and observing those impacts. So it's kind of a combination of things of what impacts are you seeing when we've had it at that level historically, and how are we going to find a balance there? Yeah, I mean, our goal is certainly not to have deer populations at a level that are preventing forest regeneration.
But that is what we're managing. I mean, that is what you have intentionally.
Not intentionally, no,
Right,
yes.
I just live 2 doors away, we have deer herd of 10 to 12 back there all the time, including the church right out here. The browse, that's what I thought this was about. How are we gonna reduce the browse? That's destroying our personal properties. It's out of control. And I used to have nice vegetation, is now all mud and barren. I've just put up 500 feet of bird netting. I'll piss the deers off. Hopefully they won't come in, but it's out of control. I don't know what else to do. Anyhow, I have a hunter, bow guy, who comes in, which has been helpful. But you mentioned the number of days. Well, what if there's 5 days and it's during the week? They work. You got to get the weekends.
So again, in the town of Hanover, that's why we have the deer management program.
I'm in that program.
That has the additional permits. And so that's not for 5 days. That's for the entire season that they can use those.
I'm not
So
a hunter,
that's,
so
that is separate from
Maybe you should become
our
one.
doe days.
Yeah.
I know, Grafton County Association will help you.
I've got an assault weapon.
Now, and do they require, does a hunter who comes onto private property, are they required to have, not a license, but a tag? I mean, are they required or are they limited in what they can take?
Yes, you have to have a hunting license. and-
No, I understand
Yes.
that, but are they limited? Like if we had 10 deer, can someone come in and take all 10 of them?
You can only take as many deer as you have tags for. So it would depend. The DMAP permits come with 2 tags. You could have a regular hunting hunting license that would come with a tag. If you're an archery hunter, you could have a tag. You could also have a special archery permit. So there's a number of
You have a
tags, but
muzzleloader tag also.
we don't have a separate muzzle load. So that would be your hunting license tag.
It's not a separate tag.
It's not a separate tag. No.
So inviting a hunter into your private property
Yes.
does not give them full access to all your deer.
No. You can find a couple different ones and combined maybe.
Can we change that law?
You could invite several hunters.
Yeah. Inviting more than one, perhaps.
Yes.
Problem there.
Becky could expand, new this year, you can now shoot 2 deer
Yes.
before you have to register the
You
first.
can, yes. And that change was made in part because of people now being able to register online, but in hopes also of maybe increasing the success rates in some of these units, like Unit M on the seacoast, where we have antlerless permits that come with 2 tags, or DMAP permits that come with 2 tags. If you see 2 deer and you have the opportunity to harvest 2, you can now harvest both of them. You can harvest as many as you have tags for without having to leave and go to register your deer.
Does the landowner need a tag on his property, or is just the hunters coming in?
A landowner can harvest a deer on his property and use the tag that comes in our hunting digest. A special landowner tag.
Can I make a couple points?
Yes.
Live in Hanover on the deer committee, which used to be very active. We lobbied the state for 5 years to get the DMAP permits, and the biologists have upped those permits every year. Becky's offered extra permits this year, up to 175, up from 150. The town has to request those tags, and the town is dragging their feet. I just met with them 2 days ago, and one of the crazy reasons is administrative time. So we volunteered to come help them with administrative time. But anyway, the town has to request for Becky to give us tags. And we have, in the last few years, about 175 people apply in the lottery for 150 tags. So we're trying to go to everybody gets a tag that wants one. So that's one point. Second point is, in New Hampshire, you can bow hunt in downtown area. We can hunt in your yard.
Oh, I don't think so, because I
I
looked
think-
at the
no.
map and I saw it that I'm a no-go. Isn't that your impression, Bill?
This gentleman knows more than I do, but my understanding, if you're 3 contiguous property owners say you can hunt in a deer stand, you can hunt with a bow.
That's
And
exactly
That was
right.
tried, but that was tried by one person, but they didn't get approval of the 2 contiguous property owners. Am I off base?
Can I finish, Bill?
I apologize.
So the secret is you have to have your neighbors.
I only have 1 contiguous neighbor.
Well, you got to convince your neighbors. You got to convince your neighbors.
That's the college.
People do hunt between your house and the river. They do. But anyway, there are people in your neighborhood who do allow hunting, but you need more neighbors.
I guess one of my other concerns, though, is Lyme disease.
Convincing your
fact that
neighbors will be easier than convincing them to change the laws.
The fact that there's so many deer and there's so many people that wander around, and both of my children have had Lyme, and they're older and they don't live in this area. In fact, they live in an even more densely populated area and have gotten it. And my theory is that someday some Dartmouth student's going to get it and the parent is going to say that the town and the college have not controlled the deer population and they're going to get a lawsuit, and then something will be done about it.
Other questions? I've missed a hand. How about on any of your people online?
Yeah, someone is asking, it's a related question to one earlier, but how did New Hampshire and Vermont measure the effect that deer numbers have on forest regeneration and the cascading effects on other wildlife, and factor this information into determining how many deer can be hunted? Specifically, what plant and animal populations are measured?
Is Nick online?
He is here. If he
Can
wishes,
he hear that question?
He can hear that question.
Can he answer it and we can hear?
If he turns on his video,
I'll give
I can spotlight it.
Becky just a chance to catch her breath before we hit her again. Nick?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I'm gonna pretty much parrot what Becky said earlier, but
we don't have hard data on, forest impacts from deer. It's extremely difficult to measure. It's incredibly variable from one property to the next, or even on the same property. So it's really hard to get data that's useful to set, management objectives. I would say where we consider that, just like New Hampshire, is when we're setting our population objectives. We do set ours as a actual deer density goal, a number of deer per square mile. But again, it's basically set when we make the plan at how many deer have we had in the past and what impacts were we seeing at that level. And if we were seeing significant impacts in the past at, say, 15 deer per square mile, we're going to set a goal lower than that. And if our population is above our objective, we expect to still continue to see impacts. So the issue is not necessarily where our goal is. I would argue the issue is how can we actually get to our population objectives? At least in Vermont, that's been our problem. Is people tell us we need lower objectives, but we're not at our objectives. So we need to actually get to those objectives and see if we see improvement when we can get there.
Thank you. Becky, you want to add to that? I want to give you a chance to catch your breath.
I think I already answered a similar
Okay.
question earlier, yeah.
Anybody else on remote Zoom? Yes.
I had a question about vegetation, which is sort of picking up on what Don talked about, and over here too. There's a handout here that the Vermont foresters worked on in 2012. And it finally got into a booklet just recently. But it's all about vegetation. And I'm wondering, should we be training neighborhoods to be looking at the browse and detecting it? I think that was one of the things, this whole program, we have smaller programs that we hope to hold later in the summer and the fall. And so training people to assess, I don't know how to set it up or where you would want it, but it seemed to me that between the county foresters and trained individuals, we could be feeding you some of this data about vegetation. And would the Game Commission go along with this? So it's wonderful to have people from the Game Commission, both of them here, to just be thinking about that, because it really does come down to vegetation and what we're losing there. So I just throw that out and let you.
Which is also what Ryan was talking about. And
yeah, I mean, so, the more eyes and the more people you have doing this, the better, right? But the question is then, what are those data going to inform? And that's how you would structure the collection of that. So if there's an avenue for that to inform, how we approach areas that are maybe DMAP or whatever some of these strategies are, then you can build a monitoring protocol around those data that you need. So
I've got a question for Nick. Nick, do you think the implementation of the crossbow permits had any impact on the numbers of deer being taken?
Yes, in short, I do. We made a lot of changes at the same time, so it's hard to kind of pick one piece out. But from what we can tell, crossbows definitely increased our archery participation in archery hunting. So I think we have more people archery hunting, and we have people who probably did archery hunt some getting out more now that they can use crossbows.
And crossbows, you can use crossbows in places you would never want to use a firearm.
Right.
Gary, you should probably tell us what the changes were in crossbow.
Well, for many years in Vermont, the only one that could have a crossbow had to have a doctor's letter that said they couldn't pull back a bow, whether it's a recurve or a compound bow. With a law change, I don't dare say, it's a age, right?
It was, when the first time the law changed, it was anybody over 50.
Okay, that was when it started.
Crossbow, and it was 2020 that opened it up to everybody to go to a crossbow.
Becky, Jenn, excuse me, I'm semi-senile. Sometimes my doctor, he'll tell you, sometimes more senile than others, anytime. But anyways, I used to hunt with a compound bow, and I had a rule of thumb that I would not hunt in October with my bow unless I started shooting at least twice a week in August, and that I could hit an 8-inch paper plate from various elevations and distances. Because I have this thing about wounding an animal. I don't have to spend a lot of time with my crossbow to be very accurate. Okay? It's a very accurate weapon. You know, you can sight it in, and if you can start being consistently hitting, you can be very effective. And, you know, I could shoot, well, you know, off somebody's lawn pretty easily. But anyways, I'm not, yes, sir.
So this is a question for either the state biologists, I guess. You know, the numbers that Ryan provided for us, 8 to 10 deer per square mile, was sort of the point at which you started to see, you know, individual species impacts. So, you know, ideally for vegetation reasons and others, you're shooting for numbers below that. You know, you guys are in a tough spot. You know, the quality hunt, I mean, people are paying to do this. Your revenue, your salary is paid for with license fees. So you need to maintain a certain level of hunt quality in order to attract the people to harvest the deer. So you're sort of pinched between keeping enough deer on the landscape that you have a quality hunt and not having too many deer on the landscape that you're having environmental problems. So just in your best judgment, if you're maintaining deer at 6 to 8 or 5 to 8 or 5 to 7 deer per square mile, which is below the level which the estimates are that it affects landscape, do you still provide a quality hunt, or are those things always going to be at odds with each other?
I mean, I think that's a fairly low density, and I mean, when you give that number, is that a number that, I mean, it varies across habitat types, right?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of difference there.
Right.
So I think your point's well taken, right? The density in which you're not seeing impacts to regeneration, is that still a quality hunt? I would say that generally speaking, when people are throwing out round numbers as a goal in hardwood forest, it ends up being about 10 deer per square mile. But I think, you know, it's still kind of, you know, I don't think that addresses your question about quality of hunt while being at a density lower than what we're currently experiencing.
Do we have an unsolvable problem, is what I'm asking? Are we trying to maintain a quality hunt while maintaining a healthy ecosystem, and do those two numbers ever, is there a sweet spot, is what I'm asking?
I mean, that's tough to know for sure, especially without solid numbers on density. I mean, I think we do our best to find a balance, and I think that we have that in a lot of parts of New Hampshire. I mean, obviously we're here today because there's a lot of folks that feel that deer are overabundant in Hanover and maybe surrounding areas, but that's not necessarily the case in the rest of the state.
Can I add to that too, as a board member and a hunter? I'd like you to define what a quality hunt is. I can go out and I can have the best hunt and not see a single deer for the day. Sure. Be in a low density area and have the best hunt. I can go to an area that has a lot of deer and see a lot of deer and still have a great hunt. Or maybe it's not such a good hunt because the deer aren't in good shape.
Well, there's the beam, the antler size.
Yeah, absolutely.
All that stuff that stats for that states use building to the sense of a quality hunt for a lot of people that are. Sure. You know,
and we're seeing that the deer aren't as healthy as they should be. To me, that's not a quality hunt.
Right.
So I'd rather see less deer in better quality than more and less. As somebody who hunts and cares about the animal.
So I'll add to that question too. I think because I've done similar things in other states, and I think You bring up an interesting point because a lot of my work has been down in New Jersey where we have extreme deer densities. But consistently when Fish and Wildlife do their surveys, they get the response that people want to see more deer. And that's a difficult problem to deal with, right? And you know, to the points you've been hearing, collecting those data, especially vegetation data, it's difficult. That's why I think once we start getting a sense of where these tipping points, for lack of a better term, you know, we can use density as a proxy, and then there's ways in which we don't have to, you know, survey the entire state. That's unreasonable. But luckily, our states are broken up into management units. Those management units have dominant habitats within them. So there are probably processes in which we can really streamline how this data is collected and hopefully kind of inform, you know, some of those questions that I think are coming out of your question.
This gentleman had a question. Next. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, I was going to comment on the quality hunt question.
Please.
If you go back 80 years, there were more hunters according to the graph that we saw. And would people say that it was, but people were not complaining about the deer eating all the gardens. Was it a quality hunt then? If so, there's none of this contradiction that's worried about.
Sure. Again, I mean, obviously depends on the hunter. The definition of a quality hunt is going to vary widely. So
I know long since dead, my father and uncles and so forth, but they talked about during the 40s hunting all, you know, a real lot and never seeing a deer. Then during the 50s, we started giving up our small farms. The so-called back pastures where you put the young stock for the summer, those became forests. Our deer herds, at least in Vermont, really bloomed. And that's when we started realizing we need to cut back, and that's when we started realizing we needed antler seasons. But, you know, I would agree with him. My quality hunt may be different than his and different than her, you know. That's a perception, but yeah.
If I may, I'm a product of the 70s and 80s. I remember I've seen the deer population go from very low. We have a fantastic deer population. If you want to shoot a big rack buck over 200 pounds, this is the time to hunt. As far as a quality hunt for the old timers that want to go find that big buck, we've got big bucks in New Hampshire, and they're out there. The trick is getting the guys in their 60s to shoot the does. Because the older guys don't shoot the does. And they've got these great programs where they allow kitchens to take the deer that you want to shoot.
I'm one of those.
So if you've got
I hunt in Hampshire also. But
so if you've got an extra tag, you can, you know, if you want.
I shoot the doe on my own land because I got too many. So in New Hampshire, I'll go for a buck. Got a question from the.
We have another question from Zoom from Adair Mulligan.
Oh, Adair.
She asks, would it be helpful if larger landowners, such as those of us who own and manage conserved lands, set up exclosures to measure browsing pressure? If so, who should we consult to be sure the experimental design is useful and appropriate? The Hanover Conservancy has just acquired 140 acres on Moose Mountain, and our draft stewardship plan includes this idea.
So, I mean, you guys already have some exclosures set up, correct? With the trillium plots, or no?
No, I'm gonna put one up in a couple of weeks.
Oh.
On town forest. We have exclosures for trillium.
Yes, okay.
We
Those are small.
monitor
Yes.
deer.
Okay, small ones, yes.
We assess the deer browse by looking at trillium stations that volunteers check. There's an exclosure of 1 meter of trillium. And actually, we've learned that trillium recover from deer browse, and about 3 years later, they're stopped to bloom in the cage. Outside, there are 2 control plots where there's trillium, and they measure the stock and count them, and then also check to see if they bloom. Not many of the control plots have blooms. When does that bloom get eaten? It's often in June, early summer, meaning that the deer have moved back into the area, the DMAP area that we have. I think we need in Hanover we just need to set up more DMAP areas. And I think I'd like to learn what hunting strategies would be most effective if the hunters were to go in pairs or threesome or share a parcel of one of the DMAP areas in town. I'm wondering if we wouldn't have a higher success rate for the people who are get those tags. That was something I was hoping we could talk about.
There are two enclosures on Balch Hill. They were set up by a Dartmouth, I'm gonna say biology class.
They're not there now.
Well, they didn't maintain them, but what they found out is that over the period of 3 or 4 years when they did monitor, the deer had already eaten all the seed base that's in the understory. The seeds had come up and sprouted until there's no more seeds to come back in. So we're already past that point in Hampshire.
Well, the plants didn't like hemlock either.
So anyway, there were some enclosures, they were monitored, and probably they've
So
not
that's
been,
just
not
a
been
question.
maintained.
Is New Hampshire considered crossbows?
So you can hunt with a crossbow during muzzleloader or firearm season throughout New Hampshire.
You're really
using-
old.
Or if you're over 68, there's a few laws, let me make sure I get them all right. You can also use them during the archery season in units L and M, so those seacoast units. And you can also use them if you have a disabled crossbow permit. We haven't expanded that beyond those 2 units. I do sometimes hear from folks that support that. I also hear from folks that don't support that. We do have a very long archery season in New Hampshire that is, and you can kill any deer throughout that whole season. Crossbows do tend to increase success rates. So some of our units where we're, our far northern units where have been below objective lately, although now they're just creeping up towards objective with our latest data, might not be able to support the increased antlerless harvest that would be associated with allowing crossbows during the whole archery season. But it's something that, we do hear about. It's possible it could change in the future. I think I maybe would be interested in a public survey of hunters to see how folks feel about that. Yeah.
So at least a couple of years ago, the antlerless days were at the front end of the hunting season. So I know of at least one hunter who said, he could have taken an antlerless doe, but he wanted to save his tag for a buck. And if he had had that opportunity at the end of the hunting season, he probably would have taken the doe because then, he knew he wasn't going to be getting the buck. So I was wondering if that's still the case and if that's something that you consider when setting up the antlerless days.
So that is still the case. I would have to think about it, and that's how it's always been. That's an interesting thought. In the units where we haven't been able to get our populations at objective using the antlerless days, we've just gone to issuing additional antlerless permits, and that can be used throughout the season. So that kind of, negates that problem. But yeah, for hunters that are hunting in units that don't have those additional antlerless permits and don't have that opportunity to use them, they would have to choose to use their firearms tag or their archery tag on an antlerless deer. And so yes, you can run into that problem that some of them are not willing to forego that opportunity at a buck.
And this is somebody who was older than 60. So.
Okay. But yeah, that's an interesting thought, for sure. I'll have to think about that one some more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
With regards to the DMAP program in Hanover, maybe a quick question. Is the Trescott Water Company land open to those permits? And then a second question. It seems, and Adair kind of alluded to this, how do we get some of the larger landowners who are not a part of that program to open their land to that permit program? Don, have you guys tried to enlist larger landowners?
We actually looked 2 years ago, we went all the way around what's the DMAP area and looked to see if there are any landowners there that would likely open their property. And for one reason or another, either the habitat wasn't, conducive to deer being there or just wasn't there. And one last comment is, to this lady is, there's two types of hunting in Hanover. There's legal hunting and there's socially legal. They're not the same. We may be legal, but they're not socially legal. That's a tongue in cheek, by the way. Just in case you missed that.
Yes. And everybody wants to go home, but I have a friend who lives in the area who advanced, I think, the most logical theory as to why there has suddenly been this overpopulation of deer in the area. I've been there on Ockham Pond for over 30 years now, and she's been there maybe about 20 years. Anyway, her theory is when the college banned or put in the leash law, or I should say the town did, and the fraternity house dogs could no longer run loose, that's when, because they chased the deer away. And I have to say, I never had a problem with deer until, maybe about 10 years ago.
So you're saying there are good things about the fraternity houses?
Fraternity house dogs
Okay.
kept the deer at bay. So think about
Let the record show she likes fraternity houses.
I like their dogs.
Sorry,
Chase the
I
deer
couldn't
away.
resist. Nick and they talked about, you can't count the deer. They're not like cattle fenced in. So you have to have the trends, the buck kill, the doe kill, they go up and down. Another good indicator is the road kill, the motor vehicles. If the herd is really up, you start getting a lot of motor vehicle collisions. And at least up my way, we're getting a lot of motor vehicle collisions. Anybody else? You want to say something? Goodbye, good night, something?
Well, I would like to thank Barbara.
Yes. Barbara?
Barbara.
You've gotten something out of the presenters, but also I hope you're able to make some connections among yourselves here tonight. You've heard other people you may not know ask questions, but make those connections because you got to work together to help to solve this problem.